Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jon, and I'm leading the business development for SmartTrial. We've had a bit of information about the regulatory side of things and a little bit about clinical strategy and clinical activities in relation to the MDR. What I'm going to be presenting for you now is a little bit more for practical experience from within the area of post-market activities, but it highly relates a lot to some of the early stages of clinical operations for medical devices as well. So because we are a vendor within the area, I kind of feel obligated to share some of the experience that we had over the past couple of years working with medical device manufacturers, but also to spark some ideas of how you could potentially utilize some of our knowledge for your own greater good and maybe inspire some ideas for your own future activities. So the title is named Collecting Clinical Evidence in Post-Market Setting, 3 Success Stories, but I'm actually going to be touching upon some of other points related to post-market clinical data collection in general as well. So I'm going to get my pointer here. A little bit about myself. Like some of you know, I'm originally from Iceland, like some of our other colleagues here in SmartTrial, but we live in Denmark now. I'm located in Copenhagen. And throughout the years, I've had different roles within the industry, everything from clinical database management for clinical research to being a data entry and technician in pharmaceutical-based trials. And now today, my primary goal is to help medical device companies throughout Europe and other places of the world, bridging the gap between their devices and clinical evidence out in the field. So, as a software company, we have a very simple goal, and that is to build smart tools that can help medical device companies collect and manage data out in the field. And that means that in order to do that, to enable you or other manufacturers to conduct clinical studies, collect data, and manage it in a smart manner, we need to be able to get a little bit closer to the industry and have these talks like we're having today about what challenges are we facing and what current challenges can be solved by using tools that exist already. So our vision in itself is to become a tool that can be used in different manners throughout the medical device lifecycle. And some of the success stories that I'm going to be sharing with you today and our experience on the post-market activities originate from everything from the V&V stages of a medical device lifecycle to investigations, and then again also to PMCF follow-ups or post-market clinical follow-ups. So there are 3 takeaways for today. First of all, because some of you come from companies that already have devices out in the field, the increased requirement for general post-market clinical follow-ups might leave some uneasy. So my goal, first of all, is to share a little bit about what we are seeing medical device manufacturers do within the area, to maybe spark some ideas to how you could approach it in a similar manner. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about common pitfalls that we often observe with medical device companies that are going on to collect data out in the field, whether it's for the first time or the 100th time. And these common pitfalls are something that we see again and again and again, but these can easily be mitigated by utilizing simple methods to approach them in the correct manner. And lastly, I'm going to be telling you about 3 success stories that we have had the privilege to work with a couple of different medical device companies out in the field that have had great success with collecting data in a post-market setting. What worries me a lot and is kind of the inspiration to this particular presentation is the current state of the industry in itself. Those of you that have been within the regulatory side of things, you might know RAPS and KPMG as well. They've conducted surveys for the past 2 years within the medical device industry to ask, how are you guys doing? How are the companies doing within the field in relation to the MDR? And surprisingly enough, last year in this survey that they did, they found out that 58% of those companies that participated didn't have any data collection strategy in place for the post-market activities. This is very disturbing because you would think that this is something that is already in place and companies are doing something about, but in reality, it's not. A lot of it has to do with budgeting and stuff like that and regulation not being very strict on it until date. But there are a couple of other reasons to why this is still a very big concern for many companies. A year later, this summer, there was a new survey which was released in September, a couple of weeks ago. And for those of you that's what's the news, you might have seen that only 27% of all medical device companies are going to be ready by May with the MDR. What that survey also showed was that 43% of all respondents didn't even started working on their PMS procedures, so updating their current procedures. And still 30% of those companies that responded didn't even have a PMS strategy in place. That's very interesting because, again, this number should highlight that something should have been done already in 2018, but it looks like still now, in the September of 2019 going forward, companies are still struggling. So why is that? Well, first of all, there's a great lack of existing procedures within the industry in general. A lot of these companies have not had the possibility to establish systems in place to conduct post-market activities in general. Yes, we do a lot of traditional PMS, but it's not proactive. Secondly, there's a great lack of guidance. However, like Mikael pointed out in his presentation, 2 weekends ago, there was a document released by the MDCG, which is the Medical Device Coordination Group from the European Commission, which highlighted a couple of guidance documents that are going to be beneficial in that pathway. But in all honesty, it's not been released in time, and who knows when these documents are going to be released, hopefully by the end of this year. But these guidance documents hopefully will help us a little bit along the path, and those companies that haven't even started working on their procedures can maybe use that as a reference. There's a third reason to why many have not prepared well enough yet, and there is lack of inspiration. We are all in our own shell trying to work out what our company needs to do in terms of PMCF or post-market activities, and that alone, not only PMS, but also clinical evaluation in general. But the lack of inspiration is huge because people are not talking together. They might see how other competitors are doing things, but they're not really interacting with each other. And that's also why a lot of companies are now trying to focus on getting their people out in the field, visiting conferences, going to a clinical evaluation, clinical investigational conference to try to get some inspiration to how they can address this particular matter. And lastly, there's still great lack of technical know-how and methodological know-how within the industry, which is understandable because people that have been working within clinical operations, they don't necessarily have the technical know-how to understand how they should go about collecting the data. Yes, we might understand clinical requirements well enough and how to conduct studies and what data we might need to collect, but we lack the inspiration and the experience related to how to do it to get it started. So some companies that we've talked to over the past 12 to 18 months have seen the increased requirements for clinical activities within the MDR as kind of like a regulatory burden. It's something that we have to overcome, and we have to do it fast, and we have to do it with small amounts of money, and we have to figure out how we can get around it. What they like to see, and this is also what Karen mentioned, is actually the chance for us to innovate a little bit using this, for example, PMCF for our benefits in terms of sales and marketing, for example. Because PMCF in general, post-market clinical follow-up, is not just about updating your clinical evaluation report. It is actually a chance for companies to develop not only stronger claims, but also gather information on usability, design, and off-label use. And this is exactly what Mikael and Karen were also talking about earlier this morning, or today, because this feeds very important information into the R&D, but also marketing, business, and development. And that can result in a lot stronger competitive advantage out in the field, let alone also a better overview of how your device is perceived by its users and how it performs out in the real world. This is what you and other clinical staff in medical device companies should be using to market your work, because this is what the C-level executives and the management can understand. we fail to present it often to these higher management levels because they only think about money and budgeting and getting things in order. But we really have to turn it a little bit around and try to picture the value that we really get out of it. Because if you look at the regulation, in reality, it hasn't changed that much. One of the key sentences that really has changed it is the access to data. The need for data, evidence has always been there, but the access to it is now a little bit different. So when we look at PMCF and data collection in a post-market setting, we've seen this similar drawing before this morning as well. There are a couple of scenarios that we need to make sure that we go through, and so we're all on the same page here. So PMCF in itself does not necessarily mean that you have to conduct a study or an investigation itself. It all really starts in identifying your gaps in your claims. So even though you have a product on the market, you really have to figure out if the claims that we have for our device are sufficient, on the evidence that we have behind that claim are sufficient enough. If we do find out that it's not sufficient, we can go and initiate planning of activities that can help us deliver the evidence that's needed for that. If that results in some kind of a post-market data collection, yes, then you can start initiating some kind of an activity. But it's important to note that even though the regulation states that you have to do PMCF, it doesn't mean that you have to do an investigation. PMCF does not equal study. Your post-market data collection can be done in different ways, but it always goes through the same circle. You start initiating the planning phase and you go along to conducting your activities, whether it's literature research or some kind of another activity, but it always ends up being analyzed on in one or another way, which ends up in some kind of a publication, and even in cooperation with some researchers out in the field, which then gets fed into your clinical evaluation reporting in your technical file. So with that in mind, those companies that we work with have not always put an equal sign to PMCF being a study. So the way that you do post-market data collection can be very different from one company to another. On that fact, we've seen different ways of how PMCF is interpreted between companies. It varies from classification to company size, etc. And what we're seeing companies planning are a couple of different things. First of all, most of them are still going to be continuing doing literature search and literature research to try to identify evidence that can be used in publications for the devices. What we see is also a huge gain in the use of the term studies, which can then be categorized into two different types of studies: comparison studies and registries, but also studies that have something to do with your device being used in a new manner, etc. But what we're seeing is that most are thinking about conducting some kind of a registry or comparison study where you do observational data collection in one or another way. Another very hot topic is also investigator-initiated studies, IITs or IIS studies. These are becoming very important and very interesting for many companies because they see this as an easy way out. Investigator-initiated studies is usually something that's done by the researchers at the universities or hospitals, and companies see them as a chance to connect into a research project that's ongoing to acquire some data that could be used for clinical evaluation. However, what many fail to realize is that that can actually end up being a lot more costly than actually doing your own research study in the end. But then again, it highly depends on the classification of the device, the size of the company, etc., and your connections out in the industry, if this is the smart way to do or not. What we're also seeing is that a lot of companies are starting to look at surveys as another method of collecting data out in the field. I had a talk the other day with a MedTech CRO, colleague of ours, that mentioned that a lot of the US companies that are now contacting them, asking them for help, are seeing surveys as their golden solution to collecting data out in the field. In itself, a survey can be implemented in different ways. And what we're seeing is that they're both being implemented or designed in like a cohort where they're surveying both clinicians and end users about their devices, but also using surveys for general feedback. So it depends a little bit upon your device classification again, and your size, company size, and your market in total, if that is a good way to go or not. But these are in general the activities that we're seeing companies initiating. There are a couple of different ways to conduct studies and a couple of other different ways to conduct surveys. This is not a full list of everything, but I hope that maybe some of you can see this as a potential opportunity for you to look into one of these activities at least to help you out. So, going a little bit deeper into the practicalities of collecting data out in the fields. So, the companies that we work with have different current activities ongoing when we meet them. Some have none, some have already initiated multiple studies, others have not done anything in the past. No matter what kind of a company this is or what kind of previous activity they've had, we're seeing these 7 common pitfalls happen again and again. So the first pitfall that I'd like to highlight, which you might have already guessed, is that we see way too many companies starting off collecting data with paper. Whether they're decided that they want to continue with a digital solution in some way or another later on, whether they start on paper or not, paper is going to give you a headache from day one. This is actually a set of boxes from a company that I met a couple of months back that had finalized the clinical study in Japan. And I asked him, what are these boxes all about? And he told me that they've been laying there for a couple of months, but nobody really had the time to start actually analyzing the data because nobody had the time to start transcribing it. What we're seeing is that companies are missing the fact that going digital from day one can actually save them a lot of headache in terms of time and cost, but also in terms of quality. Pharmaceutical companies have been using e-clinical solutions to collect data since the 80s. And there's no real difference between the medtech industry and the pharma industry in terms of the data quality that you need to collect. It has to be a good quality. But the way you collect it can be very different from one method to another. And we don't really see a chance for companies going forward continuing with paper if they're going to be upping their activities in the next couple of years. So that's the first advice we have for everybody. If you're ever going to think of starting a clinical study, don't start on paper and then go digital. Try to do it from day one. The second common pitfall that we often see is that companies are collecting too much data. I see Karen smiling there. This is a very common thing to do because you start up with some kind of hypothesis on that you like to conduct a study, and then you just go into start collecting the data without even thinking about how you're going to do it and what really you need to do. First of all, this can be very burdensome for clinical staff that you're working with in terms of the data that you're collecting. It greatly increases the complexity of operation and increases expenses and general costs in general. Our advice is to start at the end. This is something that we've been teaching our clients to do for years, and it all starts out with defining some kind of a hypothesis for what you want to do. Because most of the people that we meet have some kind of a scientific background, and it can often be difficult to move from a scientific background into the industry where it's heavily regulated and you don't have the same procedures as you did maybe at the hospital or the university. But if you think about it, every single activity, whether it's a survey, a study, or a trial, and whatever, it always starts out with some kind of a hypothesis. And the hypothesis that you want to make has to be fundamentally defined by the endpoints that you'd like to accomplish. When you define your hypothesis, the second step you should do is to define your statistical analysis plan. Again, comes back to what Karen was saying. I'm glad that we're very, we have the same kind of a vision for this. This is something that people often forget to do. It goes directly from the hypothesis to collecting data. They forget the steps that are required to figure out what is it actually that I want to be presenting. What are the tables or what are the graphs that I'd like to show to my managers or to my notified body in terms of my evidence or the endpoints that I would like to present. From there, people usually go to either start collecting data right away or writing the protocol. However, you need to dig a little bit deeper into how you'd like to collect that evidence, because even though you define how you're going to do your analysis and how you're going to present it, you need to define, okay, how do we go about collecting the data that's actually going to be used to present this graph or this table? And that relates a little bit back to the way that we collect data, whether it's going to be on paper or digital. Well, sorry, no paper, only digital. And from there, you can go about actually collecting it. So the steps that you have to go through, they vary from activity to activity, but they're always the same. Hypothesis, define what you really want to do. Secondly, define how you're going to be presenting it. Thirdly, define how you're going to collect the information. And then fourthly, you can go about collecting the data in an actual real-life setting. The third pitfall that we often see is companies forgetting about the actual individual that's going to be using the device or has a device implanted in them. Patients often don't get the chance to share their information or the experience with their devices because we're so focused on the clinical experts. Devices are very personal. Even though it's a class 1 device, a Band-Aid or an implantable cardiac device of some kind, they interact with a human being. And a person has an opinion on if the Band-Aid is going to be good to rip off or not. And they have an opinion on the device that's going to be implemented into them. So we need to make sure that if we're going to go about conducting some kind of a study or activity, that we don't forget to include patient-reported outcomes or clinical outcome assessments in one or another way. Because there can be some very highly valuable information coming from patients or users that could spark ideas to build stronger clinical claims or better market access for your product that you haven't really thought about before. Because there are information coming from these people that could not otherwise been acquired through healthcare professionals. So ePRO and ECO actually stands for Electronic Patient-Reported Outcomes and Electronic Clinical Outcome Assessments. These are very common terms that are now being used more and more in the medtech industry, but for years have been used in pharmaceutical trials, for example, to gain personal information from people that are conducting or participating in studies. Fourth common pitfall that we often see is that companies tend to rely too much on their key opinion leaders. So a key opinion leader is usually a clinician or a clinical expert of some kind that gives advice and guidance to how you should conduct your clinical activities, and etc. What tends to happen is that people forget to go a little bit beyond the clinical evidence. What you should be doing is to see if you can try to get some of the other information that can be relevant for your device integrated into your clinical data collection. So that's also related to some of what Karen mentioned, that when you're doing a study or some kind of a survey or activity, don't only focus on the clinical effectiveness, safety, and then the outcome measures. Because these are not only the parameters that you're going to be using for market access or sales or let alone just the regulatory documentation. There's vital information that can be collected about usability, design of your product, but also economic factors and insights for general research and development that you can collect during these activities. This does not mean that you should collect more data necessarily. Something as simple as a simple timestamp, or was the device intuitive to use, a standardized scale, for example. These individual questions or data points that you can collect in a very simple manner can be highly valuable for other parts of your company in terms of sales and marketing or general business development, and let alone also research and development. The fifth common pitfall that we also see quite a lot is not taking the clinical workflow into account. So a good study design does not always equal quality data. There can be quite a lot of variation between cooperative sites, hospitals, research facilities, let alone countries that can have catastrophic effects on your study. Because if we don't take those clinical pathways and the differences between them into account, you can risk missing data, lowered quality, and even dropouts and lack of motivation from your clinical staff. An example, you have a very nice protocol defined, you worked on it with your key opinion leader, and then you implement a study or activity in 7 different countries. What you find out is that the pathway in Spain is so different because they take their lunch at 2 o'clock, they don't work at all between 2 or 4, and then suddenly you have a risk of data getting lost in that time period. Just as simple as that particular thinking can have quite a lot of difference in how your data is collected and how your study or your protocol is perceived by clinical staff. What you need to do is to do a lot of testing and a lot more feedback and analysis on the actual workflows in the different sites and organizations that you're working with. Try to analyze the workflow and the differences that can be highlighted in between these organizations. Identify these risks, coming back a little bit to the risk management being incorporated into your clinical plans, how to mitigate them, and test, and test. Because if there's something that we're seeing too little, that's testing. Because a test in one clinical site does not mean that your study is going to work well or your data is going to be collected in a quality manner in another site. Mixing methods of data collection. Established companies, can have different departments doing different kind of clinical data collection. You might have a clinical validation team that does a lot of work before the product is released to market. Then you have a post-market surveillance team that does a lot of post-market active data collection. And then you also have even a clinical investigation team that runs their own clinical operations. And then you also have marketing teams that are doing their surveys, etc. What we're seeing quite often is that these teams are not working together and they're all using their own methods of collecting data. You have to find some kind of a standard that can help you collect these different kind of data in a same manner, because going forward, these departments will have to start working together. Like the drawing that Mikael presented earlier this morning, this whole process is linked from stage A early on to B, C, D, E in the post-market context. And whether it's data that's collected by your marketing staff or clinical staff, this can all be used in your technical file in the end. So what we have to do is try to build a common standard for these teams to work together and how they're going to be collecting the data. Because this not only brings overview and control to somewhat of the chaos that you might otherwise be establishing, but also ensures that you have the same data quality across all departments, one access to all your data. So if somebody needs to get access to it to present to management or investors, etc., they know where to go. And lastly, it enhances regulatory compliance because you're sure that you have one set of protocols and SOPs and quality files that should be used for this particular manner for collecting the data. So the last thing that we often see as well is that people forget GCP, good clinical practice and validation. Especially now when PMCF, post-market clinical follow-up, is being understood as a general activity, not just a clinical study. We've seen companies try to shortcut it by using non-validated tools to collect their data. What is important to note is that the MDR actually states that you have to follow a certain standard when you're collecting data, the ISO 14155. But what it also states is that you have to use technology that is validated in one or another way. So whether you're doing a very simple survey or a highly complex investigation, you should always be aware that it's better to be safe than sorry, because you don't want to be looking back 4 years down the line that all your surveys that you conducted were actually done with a tool that was not validated and it didn't comply with the standards that we needed. So try to look at solutions or methods that follow these standards when you're collecting your data, for example. Okay, so now after I've gone a little bit through what we're seeing companies initiating in terms of PMCF and the pitfalls and the mitigations that we have for some of those activities when you're collecting data, I want to share with you 3 success stories with companies that we're working with that have implemented SmartTrawle in different manners for their PMCF activities. So the first story is actually from a company that has a Class 1 and 2A device, and they work very closely with local affiliates in countries all around the world, so their own affiliates, and also local clinics that are delivering their device to the users. What they were looking to get was to start collecting updated information on their clinical efficacy and usability out in the market. So this is something that they wanted to start conducting every year or so. So the goal was to, first of all, to set up some kind of an activity that could help them get an overview of the effectiveness, support their usability and performance information, so get a little bit of an end user feedback on that. And thirdly, to see if they could get some comparison from a competitor device. So the way we did this was to establish what's called a global electronic patient-reported outcome study that they could conduct every 12 months. So the way this was set up was that when a user or potential participant came into a local clinic or local affiliate that could be recruited into this study, they were presented with an informed consent and they were asked if they were interested. And if everything went well, they were recruited through a very simple web-based interface where basic information like first name, email and SMS, email and mobile number were registered, where SmartTrawle could then initiate a pathway that lasted for 7 weeks, where they got delivered questionnaires via email and SMS on their day-to-day use of these devices. So during the course of a couple of weeks, they received a couple of different questionnaires. The study or survey was set up in a manner where they tried one device in the beginning and then a second one later on. And what we realized is that even though this worked quite well, there were a couple of cons that had to be taken into account. One of the first that we found out was that we highly underestimated the need for local overview. So even though you recruit collaborators all around the world that are willing to help you supporting your study, there was a lot of interest at the local sites to just be able to follow up. They were very interested in seeing how the devices were performing and etc. In that relation, there was a little bit more, they could see that there was a lack for support in terms of frequently asked questions as well. So even though these clinics were highly motivated in helping out, they had a lot of very simple and basic questions about the general structure of this particular study that didn't really relate to the protocol necessarily, but just sparked quite general interest. And together with that, that also relates a little bit to the subjects themselves that participated, that there could be a lot more information and engagement done in that relation with the end users. So what we saw is that the people that are participating both on the collaborator level but also the subjects were very much interested in getting a little bit more engaged or empowered in the survey or the study itself. So that's something that we have to be a little bit better in doing. What we saw as the highlights of this particular use case is that in this particular setup, they could actually reach their total sample population in under 6 weeks, where they got over 80% response ratio, so 100% of the data for 80% of the subjects was delivered. And the data on effectiveness was collected solely from the end users, so users of the device. And because they used digital data collection from the beginning, they could analyze the data very quickly and even got marketing material out in under a month from the survey was completed, which could also be used for R&QA purposes as well. Success story number 2. So this is another company that we're working with which has a Class 2B device. It's an implantable device. So they primarily work with local clinics all over the world, and they were looking for a way to collect data, initial data, from a post-market perspective. So this is a product that had been CE marked, just recently released, and they were looking for very early post-market clinical evidence data on their device. So the goal was to get more information on the general clinical use on the device, to get a little bit more information about how the device is used for different indications, and to try to identify new potential clinical strains that they hadn't observed before. So the way that we did this with them was to create kind of like an ad hoc of a setup. So this was not a traditional study in that sense, or a survey in that sense, but what we did is that we enabled them to have a very simple access to a simple web interface that allowed clinicians to initiate data collection when they needed it. So it wasn't something that they had to do before or after procedure or 5 minutes after this was done. It was more like, here's what you need to do, and when you get the time, access this link, and then you can initiate some minimal data collection. So this setup was incorporated into the clinical workflow in approximately 60 clinics. What's interesting is that the data forms that were created for this particular setup were very simple and highly hypothesis driven. So the questions that they asked were very well thought through. They were simple, predefined choices, and they were focused on gathering basic information that was enough for them to show what they wanted to establish in their clinical efficacy and use in general. Some of the cons that we observed was that due to previous setups that they had done before on paper, they kept the design at bare minimum. So there could have been a lot more data collected, because they found out that that they could have potentially done a lot more afterwards, because digital and all that. But what we also noticed is that it could have been easily have added patient-reported outcomes as well, because these subjects that were informed of this particular study were actually, or study, yeah, I could call it a study, were actually quite interested in seeing if they could deliver some data as well. So as a next step, that would definitely be an option to implement as well. They found out that the clinicians were actually very happy to help them out, because they weren't forced to do so. So this particular method of implementing something that is ad hoc, do when needed, was highly beneficial for them, because if they had a case that just didn't give them the time to deliver the data, they could skip it. But when they had the time, they could. So it allowed them to enable simple but yet quality data entry on any device in the clinic. So when the clinician was finished with the subject, they could sit down in their coffee area and have a mobile phone at hand to deliver the data that they needed to deliver. What we also saw is that the live overview of all these 60 clinics was highly beneficial for the manufacturer themselves, because then they could identify if they needed more clinics or not to try to get the recruitment or the data that they needed within the time frame that was set up. So, success story number 3. This is a little bit different of a device. It's a class 2A. It's used for monitoring in psychiatry. They work with local clinics in Europe and the US, but also key opinion leader sites in hospitals. And what they were looking to do is to establish somewhat of a post-market data registry. So registry is kind of like a study that doesn't really have an end time, but it's more like an observational study that you run to gather data that can be used for regulatory purposes. So their goal was to start collecting information on medical history that they previously hadn't been able to do before. They wanted to get a little bit more of a background on what kind of history the patients have that are receiving the device. They also wanted to collect more data on how their performance and the clinical use of the device out in the market, and of course, overview of the efficacy and outcomes. So the way that we set this up was to establish a PMCF kind of a registry study, where again, incorporated into the clinical workflow, So it was not a burden, but a part of the actual flow happening in the clinics. The patients were given a tablet in the waiting room where they could enter the first data points from their medical history in general. After they've entered their data and they came into the physician office, the physician used the device, and from the physician side, they could enter the relevant data that was needed for the registry. And then after the patient had been in the clinic, they received a set of questionnaires afterwards to ask them about follow-up information. So it was driven by ePro, patient-reported outcomes, together with what we call eCRF, or traditional case report form data entry, that could give them a complete data set to work with. So what we've seen so far is that there is a huge need for support with re-enrollment of subjects, because this device is something that's used again and again with the same subjects potentially. And they want to start looking at what happens when this same subject comes in again. Is there a possibility for us to work with that as a continuous data collection for the same subject going forward? There was a discussion at some point if we could link the local systems at the individual clinics together so it could be done even more smoothly. This is actually a big discussion within the general health tech community as well. Common standards, can we start interlinking systems between each other so we don't have to do a lot of work with doing one thing on one computer and then the same thing on the other. This is definitely something that we as a software vendor have to continue working on, because going forward this is only going to be putting more strain on people by having more and more systems actively out in the clinics. But again, what we're seeing again and again and again, that the lack of personal touch to both patients but also clinical staff is highly important, because we're working with people and people like talking to other people. And when the only interaction that happens in a study, for example, is via a digital platform, we have to start thinking about what can we do to start connecting people in different ways, communicating through the platforms that we have. So some of the pros that we have observed until now is that collecting both patient-reported outcomes and clinical information together in one place is highly valuable, because then you suddenly have a possibility of start analyzing your data together. You have information from the clinician, but also from the patient himself that can help you identify possible benefits that you hadn't observed before. We actually allowed this particular manufacturer to work with our API in a very open manner. So what they're doing is that they're communicating, so this is a machine learning system device, communicating with SmartTrial to fetch data and deliver data. So their algorithms can be improved by fetching the data that is collected out in the field and imported into their company to establish a better outcome and general performance of their own device. The clinicians saved a lot of time in collecting valuable information such as historical data from subjects, because the subjects themselves could deliver that data from the beginning in the waiting room. So this is highly beneficial, because that's basically where we're saving time for the healthcare staff, but still collecting relevant information that can be used for our clinical reporting going forward. So to summarize a little bit, so these are some of the activities that we're seeing medical device manufacturers establishing for now. I guess a couple of years down the line, there's going to be 5, 10 other activities, other type of activities that can be initiated. But to begin with, these are what we're seeing being planned for different classifications and different sizes of manufacturers. Like I said, PMCF doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have to conduct a study. There is a possibility to think a little bit broader in terms of service, but also there could be a third method that we haven't really seen today. But literature is still one of the most common ways to continue collecting clinical evidence going forward. And I encourage you all to see if there are other possibilities to access this literature in different ways, because now there are actually vendors that are providing services around this particular area that can help you make this a little more easier. So the common pitfalls: go digital, Don't focus on paper or other mediums to begin with, because it's only going to give you a headache going forward. When you plan for your data collection activity, start at the end. Remember going through the hypothesis, statistical analysis plan, data collection plan before you even go to submitting your protocol and start collecting the data. Try to see if you can include ePro and eCOA in your data collection, so using the subjects or the users themselves delivering some of the data that you might need. And remember to take the personal factor into account as well. Going beyond the clinical evidence is very important in terms of competitive advantage as well, and also reimbursement, because you're not only going to get reimbursement by showing clinical efficacy. You have to start thinking a little bit more beyond the clinical evidence. Testing and seeking feedback from your different collaborators is highly important. Testing is usually something that people just think they're done well enough, and then they go about starting the study, but actually realizing afterwards that it should have done a lot more. Because in the end, it's only going to cost you a lot more time and effort if you don't test well enough. If you're a large manufacturer, try to see if you can initiate some kind of a strategy, because this usually takes a long time to change internally, to try to combine your methods of data collection in one common way. And then lastly, make sure that you choose solutions that go for compliance and validation. And lastly, what we learn from these success stories is that clinical efficacy can actually be acquired from subjects directly. It doesn't only have to rely on clinical or healthcare staff. Ad hoc data entry, and we've seen this in other projects as well that we've done with other manufacturers, not only this one, is actually becoming a quite nice option for many. So the traditional way is that before you go into the operation theater or the ICU, you have to do this, and then after that you do that. But there is a way to set up kind of like an ad hoc study setup that can be used as well. And lastly, by including both patient-reported outcomes and eSREF into the same workflow, you save a lot of time, because you not only minimize missing data, but you also have the possibility of combining the two into one data set that allows you to analyze the data together for better outcome measures. So with that said, I know that most of you are probably following us already on LinkedIn, but going forward, we're going to be doing a lot more work in terms of white papers, blogs, and webinars, and seminars like this. And hopefully next year, we will have a lot more experience for you to share, because this is only the beginning. We have also a new LinkedIn group that was initiated a couple of months back. It's called Clinical Investigations and PMCFs for Medical Devices. So those of you that aren't a part of that group, please join. We have already 100 clinical experts and other regulatory experts within the medtech area in that group. So hopefully we can start sharing some information and knowledge between each other as well, because that's also very important. With that said, thank you for listening. Any questions so far? Anyway, yeah.
So both you and Karen talked about a lot about the combining data collection with different purposes into the same study.
Yeah.
But how to handle this protocol-wise?
So protocol-wise, so you're thinking about combining data in terms of usability, economic factors, and stuff like that, or?
So when you're designing your clinical protocol, you of course focus on the endpoints
Yeah.
and statistics and all this, and then it would be strange to include things on usability and so on, because this is not what you need for.
But not really, because you have standards within the medtech industry that explain that you have to comply with them. So if you want to exemplify that you comply with them, the only way for you is to collect some data that can prove that you do. So that's just a scientific reasoning that you have to write in your protocol, that we're going to be collecting information about usability, X, Y, Z, because we need to comply with X, Y, Z. And that's one of the ways that we believe that we can acquire this knowledge to exemplify that.
But you can end up having a statistic section that is very complicated to do then.
That's also why it's important for you to define what do I really need to collect, because you can easily start, defining hundreds of questions regarding usability. but there should be some specifics that you should be focusing on. Again, it highly depends on the device and what you really need in terms of evidence and what you don't have. For example, if you're looking at economic factors, collecting something as simple as time point start, time point end, for when your device was used can prove highly beneficial in terms of market access and reimbursement, etc. And you don't really need to collect a lot of information to prove that. You know, these 2 data points can be enough, but you still have to provide the scientific reasoning or the some kind of a clarification to why you're collecting these data. Does that answer your question? Partly?
It was more like, would you prefer to go for one protocol containing all of it, or separate protocols focusing on what's important for that protocol? You would still use several protocols on the same subject, so you still save some money on it. So it's just application-wise, how can I?
If you've never done a clinical investigation before, you don't have any activities going on, then yes, one protocol would probably be a good starting point. But remembering the fact that less is more. If you do have an established company, you have some funds, you lack evidence on usability, then yes, a single survey or protocol study that focuses on usability or design validation could be good to do. So if you're starting off with a new product, including the basics about, for example, usability could be very beneficial to be included in the first protocol. All right, thank you very much.